Chris Staple asks, FMK, play booster draft, sealed and cube.
Wow.
Well, you got to put a ring on the cube.
Oh, who we killing here?
Boy, that's the tough one.
Yeah.
That's the tough one.
I mean, for me...
I want to agree with Mary Cube. That's just a responsible decision.
Yeah, exactly. Like, Cube is always going to be there for you, right? Cube has never turned its back on you.
That art I saw recently on Blue Sky of like, I don't recall what it's from, but it's like skeletons dancing. It's like 4 skeletons dancing together, and there's like a ribbon that goes between them, and it's like Cube will outlive Magic the Gathering.
Oh, yeah, nice. I like that.
Yeah.
Testing, the headphones are broken. It's not the adapter and it's not the splitter, so I ordered 2 more pairs of headphones.
Okay.
I did a little research and just got the same ones. They seem like the best ones. I don't
Classics for a reason.
You want to hear something infuriating before we start?
Sure, yeah.
I use
3 plus 2, you say?
I use I use a photo editing app that is not made by the one cursed company that makes the most popular photo editing app that they extort people for.
Yeah.
I use one that is much more affordable.
It's too bad that they own great software.
I use one that is much more affordable. This company is called Pixelmator, and it's a great app. It's fine. It's like $30 if you have a Mac, and it does everything you need to do, right? And it doesn't cost $75 a month. What a novel concept. Anyway, clearly, if you Google a problem in Pixelmator, like, how do I do this? You get a million results that are all like someone in the Pixelmator forum asking, how do I do this? And you know there's going to be someone on that page that responds and tells you how. At some point, it appears they just deleted all of those. And so what you get instead is like their help homepage. It redirects to their help homepage. Whenever you click any of those topics, and you can't find them anywhere when you search for them, and they dominate all the search results. And
that
it's like,
sucks.
So I want to know how to make a grid, automated, like make a patterned grid, so I can just have a grid that it shows up in the image. It's not like, part of the interface, but like it's an actual grid. And my first Google attempts were just all these pages that are all redirecting to a useless page. Rage.
I hate it.
Rage bait.
It's really disappointing that the internet has gotten so useless. Do you want to hear something great, though?
Yeah.
I found a great website the other day, and I was just like,
whoa,
oh my
you found
God.
a great website?
I was like, oh my God, I need to hold on to this moment of finding a great website, and maybe also like download the entire website, because I'm sure it's just going to disappear. Anyway, it was a very, 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 very thorough, detailed blog about how to make sake.
Oh, yeah, save
and
that.
it was just like,
download whole website.
This one,
scrape,
like, clearly
scrape.
extremely thorough, detail-oriented guy. Like, no ads, just like, here's all the information. It was great.
Yeah. I think we should include this in the show. It's going to sound like an episode of Magic Doesn't Exist, but this is actually the beginning of an episode of Lucky Paper Radio.
Magic exists.
Whoa, I haven't introduced you yet. It's me, Andy. I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, Delicate Little Man Maddox.
I'm just a delicate little flower, and I'm here with my co-host, Prickly Pineapple Mangold. Am
I prickly?
No, but I just did the opposite.
I feel like I'm just a strong flavor.
Sure, yeah.
Some people really like
Prickly
my strong
Durian
flavor.
Mangold.
I'm not unfriendly. I'm a friendly guy.
Definitely, absolutely. Yes. Much more so than me.
Matthew, don't edit out that delay before he said definitely. You got to keep that pregnant pause. It's very important. Anthony, you got a topic for us this week.
I thought it'd be interesting to talk about resonance in cube design, or maybe a better way to put it is like the hook, like your sales pitch for your cube. Is that something that you...
High-level resonance, not the resonance of individual cards. And I think we should first start by defining what you mean by resonance.
Yeah.
But that's the thing that Mark Rosewater talks about a ton on Drive to Work and in his writing. But you're not talking about putting resonant cards in your cube. You're talking about your design project having a higher level resonance.
Absolutely. And Mark Rosewater does talk about that as well. He talks about this when they're designing sets and sort of ideating the world, that they need to sell every set. Like, they need a reason for people to be interested in whatever the new set is. And there's lots of different things that they use to sort of keep people engaged. And I think that a similar thing does also apply to cubes. We're not necessarily making a full fleshed out world, and obviously it's a very different context where we're not trying to get a bunch of players into the set so that they can buy a bunch of packs, but you still are trying to get people to understand your cube and engage with it in various different contexts where you're playing cube. So I think that that kind of resonance on a high level is still important to think about.
So you're telling me you expect our thousands of listeners should take advice on resonance from the guy that designed the regular and the irregular
I
cube.
was going to say, I am perfectly qualified as the person who has made the least resonant cube of all. I can speak with experience that it is
people bother you about
a little bit challenging.
Yeah. what does resonance mean? Let's start there, just on a high level.
I think it is really just what is the thing that's going to get people to care about your cube? And I wonder about like what are the contexts, maybe even just starting with context is like the most important place to start is where are you trying to get people interested in your cube and create that like connection to people? And I think that looks very different for different people, whether that's you're submitting your cube to KubeCon and you want people to notice it in this huge pile of cubes that are available to play, or if you're trying to drum up a brand new cube group and you need to both like create that hook to why are you going to play my cube, but also why are you going to be playing cube at all? And then, you know, the things in between, like maybe where we're at in our local play group, where it's not like you're trying to stand out in a field of hundreds of cubes, but you still want to have people interested and engaged with what you're doing.
See, I don't think it's as simple as just making people excited about or wanting to engage with the thing. To me, resonance is about a connection ideologically between the superficial details, the things that do not actually directly impact the gameplay, things like the name of the cube, the sleeves you chose, like all these kind of meta things, a connection between those and the actual decisions that do affect the gameplay of the cube. And I think probably the most common thing we'll talk about is like what you name your cube and what your like one sentence elevator pitch is, and is that name and elevator pitch actually effectively communicating what people are going to experience when they draft it. It could also be not really communicating that, but not in a problematic way. Or it could also be setting people up for incorrect expectations, thus causing them to get mad and feel like they were betrayed a little bit. I'll cite a member of our local playgroup here, Morgan, who, this is just so funny to me. Morgan has a cube, and Morgan's cube for the longest time was called the Mono-Decent Cube.
It was honestly not dissimilar from the regular cube in its challenge area here, where he was just like, all these cards are decent. They're not necessarily the best cards, but they're decent cards.
And Morgan, I think, recognizes now, maybe with hindsight, that sort of choosing a completely subjective descriptor, like what is a decent card,
Yeah, that is a big part of the limitation.
Choosing that meant that the way he described the cube, it's like, this is a cube full of cards that are just good. You know, it's not like the best cards ever printed or whatever. They're just good, decent cards. You know, just like good bread and butter stuff. And every single time I think I saw this cube drafted, there would be somebody in the pod that would look at a pack and say, what? Oko's not decent. That card's broken. Or I'm not sure if Oko's in the cube. I don't think Oko is. But insert some card.
Goblin Welder.
Some card somebody thought did not meet the description of decent. And they were always complaining that it was too good, right? I think if you saw a card that was not quite as good as you thought decent was, you wouldn't be mad because who cares? It's probably not going to impact the draft at all. But, you know, if you're a second pack into your deck full of decent cards and you see a card you think is way better than anything in your colors, you're going to be like, what the heck? I feel like I've been misled by the name of this cube.
Or worse, you finish the draft, you feel like you've lived up to the cube's expectations, and then your opponent does something crazy, and you're like, what the heck? That wasn't what we signed up for.
Anyway, the most recent time we drafted this cube, we always 5 minutes before we're supposed to fire the pods, we kind of organize everybody and let each cube designer give, a one sentence pitch for the cube and kind of talk to the group. And I was like, Morgan's over there with Morgan's cube. What do you got tonight for us, Morgan? And Morgan's like, tonight we have Triple Black Diamond, the cube all about doing the hardest and most complicated things you can possibly imagine. And it is the same cube that Morgan has just changed the pitch for because I think he got super tired of people being like, this is not decent, what the heck?
And that conversation didn't happen. It worked. Great rebrand.
Yes. Okay, I was not there for the... Were you drafting that cube that night?
No, but I'm assuming it was fine.
You're just assuming it was fine. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just an interesting sort of small case study in, we watch this happen week over week, and we say this all the time. You can get away with pretty much anything in cube design except for not meeting players' expectations, except for not properly setting expectations. You can play a cube full of the grindiest, slowest, worst imaginable cards. As long as you prepare people for that, that's fine. You can play a cube with huge spikes in power outliers or utterly broken things, and as long as people's expectations are correct when they sit down to draft, all of that can be great. That is the most important lesson I think to take home as a cube designer is do not upset player expectations. And it's a pretty minor way to do that when they just misunderstood what you meant by decent, but it really matters, I think. And to me, that's what resonance is, right? I will put humility aside for a moment and say that I think one of the great things about 100 Ornithopters, which I don't even think I deserve credit for naming it because the name is so obvious, but the fact that the name...
I think you deserve credit for that.
The name is so resonant. Just the name communicates so much about what that cube experience is going to be. Not even to mention the one-sentence description, right? And that to me is an example on the other side of the spectrum where saying, do you want to draft 100 Ornithopters to somebody, they immediately have a very good sense of what they're in for, right? And that doesn't mean they understand that disenchants are really powerful or they understand, that Echoing Boon is the pack one pick one they should take. It just means that they know that the draft is all about 100 copies of the card Ornithopter. And yeah, certain cube conceits are much harder to communicate, right? It's not like you or Morgan have failed just because you haven't tried to describe what makes your cube unique, but it's because what makes your cube unique is a lot more nuanced than the incredibly blunt tool that is 100 Ornithopters, where it's very easy to make an evocative name, a resonant name, because the whole thing is like extremely flavored.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. I mean, and just to go back and reiterate what you're saying a little bit, I think you're totally right that whatever the context your cube is existing in, that moment of your players are going to sit down and play it, and you need to communicate what's about to happen, what people are going to experience. That is going to be pretty universal to any cube experience. So that's the moment where I think everybody can relate to that need for resonance in order to get players all on the same page. I think there's another point you're sort of alluding to here, which is that it's not equally easy to make every kind of cube resonant. And I think that is a big reason why, especially in the last year, 2 years, there's been like a big sort of lean towards cubes that are not just presented in a way that has a really clear hook, but designed in a way to create a really, really clear hook and elevator pitch with, things like 100 Ornithopters among them.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is like, if your cube is nonsense and really over the top, then it's pretty easy to be like, welcome to Circus Land, welcome to the crazy place where the thing is crazy, and you can say what the crazy thing is. Whereas if your cube is more nuanced, it can be a lot harder.
Definitely. I mean, and that can be like, oh, this is a cube where you have a bunch of baubles for free and you are obligated to play them. Or this is the turbo cube where everything is discounted. Or this is the cube where there's 13 mirror enforcers. Like something that is extreme is often simpler to communicate.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I think what you're maybe even saying is that the fact that it's easier to communicate might even lead people to be more likely to make those kinds of cubes.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
Not only is it easier to communicate to would-be drafters, it's easier to communicate to themselves. They can set up a goal for themselves that is very clear and unambiguous if they've met it or not.
Definitely. That's something that I've definitely struggled with a little bit. So I'm serious a little bit when I say that I feel a little bit qualified to talk about this, because making the regular cube, like the way that I do present it is, this is good, clean magic. It plays like limited. That's kind of the most resonant elevator pitch that I can make. And I think that works, but it's still not as compelling as something that is as extreme as 100 Ornithopters.
Yeah, that works in a sense that it is accurate, but I don't know that it's particularly engaging, right? Which, I love the regular cube. It's one of my favorite cubes, but if a random cube is pitched to me as a cube like limited, I don't know that I'd be like, chomping at the bit to play it.
I mean, it's also difficult because I think that there is a lot of space around regular cube where you could change up the particular mechanics that are involved, or like the cards entirely, and create similar gameplay or pretty different gameplay, but that's in that space of just good, clean magic. And I think that maybe I get away with it a little bit because there just aren't a ton of cubes in that space compared to the legacy or vintage cube design space.
Honestly, it might just be that those cubes are there. They're just not popular because
that's possible.
It's so much less to grab onto. You have the benefit of a podcast as sort of a platform, but yeah, some random person with their idea of what good, clean magic is. How do you make that cube appealing such that people want to follow it on Cube Cobra or draft it at CubeCon or vote for it to be at CubeCon or whatever, right? Like, I think it's a really uphill battle.
Yeah, so how do you do that?
Well, I am somewhat passionate, actually, about naming. I've read books on naming, for example. I think I'm probably in the minority of the population that has bought and read books on how to name things.
What are those books named? I'm just
Don't
curious
call it
because
that
that's
is my favorite one.
That's a pretty good name. Yeah.
If you're interested, the book Don't Call It That by Eli Altman, which I'm pretty sure actually is now available for free as a PDF on his website. Maybe I'll double check on that and put it in the show notes. Is a really great, kind of workbook on naming. It has both a lot of theory, and then it also has steps it takes you through in the sort of guise of naming a thing. And he talks a lot about what makes a bad name, right? And there's a lot of examples of things that make bad names. And ultimately, the things that often make good names, maybe counterintuitively, are things that perhaps don't immediately evoke anything in the viewer, the audience, the listener, the player in this case, but make them curious, make them ask a question that you can then answer however you want. And you have then leeway to sort of establish your cube, in this case, not your brand, your cube, as whatever identity you want it to follow, right? So a name like Mono Decent, a lot of expectations. People are going to come to the table thinking they know what a decent card is, right? It's impossible to not have something immediately pop to mind when you think of what a mono decent card would be. But if you call your cube something like, for example, the Fire Swamp, the Fire Swamp means, I guess that's maybe a bad example because swamps are basically an type of magic, so you do have some expectations surrounding that.
But there are a lot of swamps in there, so I think that delivers.
Yeah, it does kind of deliver. But for the most part, it's like, what does that mean relative to Magic, right? Like, I don't know what kind of cards to expect to find in the Fire Swamp, especially if you maybe get the reference or just find the name evocative. You might be like, what is that? I want to know more. And then you have people that actually are engaged enough to even listen to the Cube speech or read the first sentence of the Cube Cobra overview, which is better than them sort of reading the cube name and then just sort of ducking out. So, for example, like, I would love to see more people that were naming cubes things like, the Giver Cube is another good example, I think. Keldon's Giver Cube, which is, based on the book The Giver, which has this particular idea of resources, and I won't go into the details, but the Giver Cube, what is that when you hear that? Like, it doesn't really tell you what it is. If you get the literary reference, you might have some guesses, but like, these kinds of names, and I'll say, like, I especially am drawn to cube names these days that don't have the word cube in them, personally. Like, I'm adamant that I want people to call 100 ornithopters 100 ornithopters. Unfortunately, most people call it Ornithopter Cube, which is not what I want, but that's the name people gravitate to.
It's too late. It's become its own thing. It's
yeah,
out of your
control. I don't fight that. I don't fight that battle too hard, but you will never find me calling it anything other than 100 ornithopters. I won't call it 100 ornithopters Cube. I won't call it Ornithopter Cube. I will call it 100 ornithopters. That is the name I have given to that project. But yeah, I think names like that sort of maybe pique curiosity in your audience are a lot better, because then you have room then to actually set their expectations more granularly. It also, I think, leaves you more room as a designer to like decide what fits in there. Something we've talked about in this show before is that we really like cubes that are exploring this space of heavy color imbalance, but no color is completely missing. The Fire Swamp is a great example. There's a couple blue-white cards in the Fire Swamp, maybe one. There's like very few cards in there that are not...
I think it's just the Swamp King.
Solkanar. He's not white. He's Grixis, I believe. It doesn't matter. He's got to have green in him, right? I don't know. Who cares? The point is, the cube is mostly black with some red and green, and then very little white and blue. But there are white and blue cards in the cube, right? Another cube that comes to mind here is the Red Terror, made by a local member of our playgroup, is a cube that is ostensibly about red, and specifically red's conflict with the opposing guild, which is Azorius, but also includes cards of all colors, right? So you can play cards of all colors there, but the cube is mostly very, very heavily red and Azorius leaning.
Yeah, and it's not even like a desert or a partial desert. It's just heavily skewed in one direction.
Yeah, and I think, comparing that to like a mono red cube called the mono red cube, or, a cube that's just Jund, the Jund cube, right? Which are fine cubes in their own right, but to me, a lot more limiting both to their designers and what they can be. Like, you really can't put a white card in the Jund cube. It would be extremely upsetting to your players' expectations, but you can put a white card in the Fire Swamp. And the same way you can't put, a red-green card in the mono red cube, you can put a red-green card in the Red Terror, and it works. So I really think that like these kinds of more abstract frameworks of understanding what the cube is about are actually maybe counterintuitive. People might expect that like clarity is what's important here, but I think clarity and resonance are so different, and it's important to recognize that it's better to say less and be more sort of vague than to say something that might be misinterpreted.
That's a great point, and I think that we're talking about how valuable it is, how necessary it is to just set expectations so your players know what they're getting into and, will enjoy the draft. There are some ways that you can set expectations very poorly where people will say like, okay, well, I thought it was going to be this, but it's a little bit adjacent to that. But if you're more just talking about a feeling, or it's like leaning towards mono red, it's not necessarily totally mono red, you're not setting yourself up with those like really hard boundaries that people are going to be confused by when you break them. That's another great example of a way to design a cube that is very resonant without having to make it so totally extreme. It's fairly extreme to say like 50% of the cube is red, but you still then have the opportunity to put whatever else in that cube you want without necessarily causing those kinds of moments of friction.
That's another example where I think like the 100 Ornithopters name sounds very clear, and in a sense it is, but it actually doesn't describe, like, you could make lots of different cubes with 100 Ornithopters in them, and they could all be very, very different. Many people have. So it doesn't actually really tell you much about like what happens beyond that. And I think that's okay. It's kind of meant to be like a, we're going to give you the log line, and then you get to discover what that actually means in this context, which is my unique take on what it would take to make 100 Ornithopters playable. That's an important lesson maybe for people, is that clarity and like concision of purpose is not the same thing as resonance.
Do you think we're maybe taking for granted a little bit that a cube has a name, though? I feel like I was just listening to some podcast where somebody was talking about their early cube experience, and that idea of cubes being a name and like striving for this kind of resonant experience was foreign to them, at least when they first came to it some years ago, because for a while it was just like, yeah, this is the cube. In fact, I would say your cube was similar to that, where it was just the cube in the playgroup, and so you named it after the playgroup. In fact, maybe I'm thinking of you on another podcast saying this, but...
Yeah, and I mean, that's not a good name. And in hindsight, I wish it wasn't named that, but I think to change it at this point would be disingenuous because that's what that cube is. But I will say that cube does have the benefit of, like, people are curious when they hear that name for the first time.
People ask questions,
They're
sure.
like, what the heck is that? But it's not effective. I don't think it's a resonant name at all. Because, like, you can go too far. You can name your cube some absolute nonsense gobbledygook that means, like, literally nothing at all. And then it's like, all right, well, maybe I'm curious, but it's not going to tell a cohesive story. Whereas, like, the Fire Swamp, you're curious, and then it delivers on that. And then you play it, you're like, oh, yes, this does feel like the Fire Swamp. Or the Red Terror promises something, and you don't quite know exactly what it means. Is it all red, mostly red? Who knows? And I think it does deliver on that promise when you actually play it. So it's not like you should just say something random to get him in the door and then just play whatever cube you want. You still have to have some
Don't make a
ideological...
clickbait cube.
No clickbait cubes. Jesus Christ. None of those. You do have to have an ideological through line between the superficial details of the environment and the mechanical details of the environment. It's just that through line can be a little more artsy or abstracted than perhaps people are giving themselves credit for.
For sure. I mean, so there's this relationship between, we're talking a lot about the name of a cube and your elevator pitch and these sort of meta decisions you're making about the way that a cube is presented. But ultimately, obviously, the resonance also comes through in the cards you're choosing. And it's very valuable and very effective if you can create sort of a continuity between those two things and have the cards that people see in packs reflect that expectation that they've been set by this hopefully resonant message that is going to communicate what this experience is all about.
Another good example here, I think, is Lincoln's Penrose Cube.
I find that to be confusing.
Okay, well, let's talk about this. First, let me give you my perception of it. So I bet you know a lot more about the namesake of the cube than I do. I didn't even know until I just confirmed by Googling that Penrose was a mathematician, but I think I knew the word had carried mathematical significance. Before I even played that cube, just seeing the name of it, I think it throws a shape of like something that's meant to be kind of simple or elegant or clean, which is in fact one of the major goals of the Penrose cube, is to be this kind of like clarified version of cubing. So I find that name to be very successful. I imagine you have very specific associations with Mr. Penrose that makes you feel like that cube does not deliver on them?
Yeah, well, I think it's funny because I think that name is effective, and I totally agree with that kind of narrative of like, Penrose was a mathematician. He's famous especially for creating Penrose tiling, which was one of the, I think maybe the first aperiodic tiling systems. Super cool math stuff. If you're interested in that, go check it out. So I thought the same thing when I drafted it first, and I was like, oh yeah, this is going to be like a little bit mathy and elegant and simple, but have this kind of like aperiodic nature. Every draft is going to be a little bit different. Turns out it's not connected to Penrose the mathematician at all. It's just named after, I think, the town or like some location that's relevant to where he was designing the cube. And
but that
so
doesn't
it's
matter.
like,
who cares about that?
it's like a totally false narrative that I agree sort of works, but then turns out isn't true.
Well, I think that's actually an important point. It doesn't have to be true. Like, I think maybe the reason the name stuck instead of something else was that it did have this other sort of texture to it that felt appropriate, even if the origins were not the complex origins you were thinking of.
Yeah, that could be true. I mean, I don't know how much most people know and think about Penrose, but...
Like, for example, a pretty common trope, I would call these days a like trope of a bad name because it's been done too much, but a pretty common trope for a long time was to basically take a word associated with the thing and then look at that word in a bunch of other languages. And what you end up with is a thing that the audience you're speaking to does not speak the language you've pulled this foreign word from, but it ends up having like some kind of linguistic roots or something that kind of just feels right. Like it feels like it's kind of belongs. Like there's some sort of common ancestor word or common ancestor something that like makes it feel kind of appropriate. And that's an example of like, you know, the origin here is like totally false in the sense that like this language is irrelevant to people. You've kind of just pulled a random word from another language that happens to have a superficial connection, but it ends up feeling right. That like feeling right is so much more important than having like a cogent story to explain how you got to your name. If you have to explain it a bunch for it to make sense, that is not a sign of its success, right? It should be immediately communicated, like very punchy.
And I think a really important part of that, of like making that communication effective, is simplicity. I think that, you know, I am definitely guilty of this in my cube overviews, that they are just sort of like, especially the regular cube, is kind of just a wall of text, because honestly, that description was not written as an elevator pitch for people to play it. It was written for my own design process.
Didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly. I've been meaning to update that for literal years. We'll see if I ever get around to that. But I think that's a really important lesson for anybody that is trying to use that description or use their elevator pitch or their pre-draft speech, whatever they're communicating to their players, is keep it simple, because the more you add to it, the more likely it is for a particular detail to be the thing that stands out, or for that core message just to get lost. Or, I mean, frankly, people just are not going to listen to and pay attention to more than a couple sentences.
For sure.
So sort of related to the fact that I think a lot of cubes are designed in such a way to have a clear elevator pitch, and I think that that is a big part of the reason that we're seeing a lot of very extreme cube designs. I also feel like it's much more resonant to be doing a single thing at a time, and I think that sometimes people sit down and start designing their cube and they're like, well, it's about like 7 different things. And we have like this rules modification, but then also we have a bunch of conspiracies, and then also we're making it about this creature type matters. And I think that a cube can have many things happening at one time, but having clarity of message and sort of focusing everything related to the one driving force that people are connecting to, and that's really resonating with what is the core experience about, makes a much more compelling and easy to understand and get your head around experience. Do you agree with that, or do you think that there are some cubes that like really effectively just do multiple things at the same time?
I think there's always layers. Like, I think at the highest level, most of the things the cube are doing should kind of fall under one bucket. But I think every cube, and especially the best cubes, do have a lot of depth. And we've talked about this a lot with like our, I forget what we even call it now, the process where you like started a card as a seed crystal, and then we like basically end up kind of designing or like theory crafting a whole cube from a baseline card. You know, I think a lot of things that start as, you know, ostensibly about the fire swamp or whatever, when you go like 2 steps removed, you say, oh, what makes sense in the Fire Swamp cube? You know, it's, well, cards about swamps and cards about whatever. And then you realize that certain like creature types are relevant to that. And then you like, I don't know, you arrive at changelings, or you arrive at, you know, you're putting Nameless Inversion in the cube. And it's like, well, what does Nameless Inversion have to do with the Fire Swamp? Nothing, except that it's like 2 steps removed if you follow this sort of logical path. I think the best cubes have a like cogent start, but then branch off in a lot of different directions and provide a lot of depth. And you realize like, oh, actually the Changeling deck is a thing here. That's not even a thing in that cube. I'm just trying to like make up an example on the spot, which is hard.
Totally. No, I think you're right. And I think that what I said could easily be misconstrued.
As in, I just did?
No. I think that many people, this is a common thing that I see with cube designers, is they will, especially newer cube designers, they get stuck on some core conceit, and then they try and make literally everything about their cube relate to that, like every single card. So it's like, oh, here's my cube that's about, to use another example from our local play group, which is not so limiting, so I don't think it's that problematic, but the cube is about numbers, and every single card relates to numbers in some way. And I think that you can make a cube where it's like 20% of the cards relate to some core theme, and that still be visible. Maybe not with something that's as broad as numbers, because all kinds of cards relate to numbers, but if it's a particular creature type, or you really want it to be feeling like it's about combat, or feeling like it's about enchantments, you don't need every single card to have the word enchantment on it for that theme to come through. So yeah, I think you're right. Like, I think it makes sense for there to be some core idea that is sort of leading expectations and leading the narrative, but that doesn't mean that every single card needs to be relating to it in an explicit way.
I would go so far as to say that it's probably way better if it's not. Like, if you actually have your entire cube focused on one thing, then there's nothing to contrast against it to make that thing seemingly matter. And the example we've often given here is like cubes where all the mana value of cards is 1 or 2. It's like, okay, like the thing a 1 or 2 drop does in normal Magic is not be a 5 or 6 drop, right? Like when everything's 1s and 2s, it's actually no longer about aggro at all, because everybody has a turn 1 and turn 2 play. So you can't possibly go under anybody else's cards, and it becomes a weird game of attrition where you're all playing cheap cards that have activated abilities or modes that allow them to be cast for more mana, or some sort of mana sink involved with them. It like kind of completely changes what the thing is when it doesn't have the contrast of other stuff, right? If you have an Enchantment Matters cube and everything's enchantments, what's an enchantment anymore? That's just meaningless, you know?
Yeah, and I think that this especially comes from players that are really excited about a particular theme, and they're used to designing a deck and making a deck where everything is both mechanically and aesthetically all about that thing. And that makes sense in a single deck that you're playing and all the cards literally need to work together.
And in a game of Commander or whatever, where you're playing at a table where not everyone else's deck is full of only enchantments, therefore there is something to throw that contrast.
But then if you extend that to a cube, it's like, well, do you want to be playing that mirror match all night, or do you want the opportunity for you to draft a deck that is about that particular theme that you love, but yeah, see it in contrast to other things which make more sense and not just be the mirror match?
Yeah.
Like you said, there's layers, and having a clear expectation that begins the narrative that players go into a draft having some clear expectations, and then making sure that the design of the cube doesn't upset those expectations, but also doesn't just box them into them and allows them to explore deeper things and say, okay, well, I had some idea of what the fire swamp would be like, and now that I'm in here, oh, it makes sense that the pack rats is here because we need to have the rodents of unusual size. And, oh, it's interesting that the Swamp King is here. And that makes sense that you're breaking the sort of like loose color restriction for that particular card. So there is more to that narrative than just that explicit hook.
I'll say some examples of cubes I think that maybe commit a little bit too hard to the bit. If you are the designer of one of these cubes, please do not take this personally. This is just an example of a cube that I think you've managed to box yourself in a little bit in terms of what the cube can be. I actually forget the name of this cube. It was like the Dichotomy Cube or something. It was at the first CubeCon where every card was either black or white. And the interesting shtick here, actually, which was that the cards were in sleeves of matching color, which I imagine CubeCon would not let you do now. But year one, things were loosey-goosey.
Year one was a different time.
So you would look at someone's deck and you would clearly see if they had white or black cards in their deck. And then Plains and Swamps were also sleeved accordingly. So, you could see the color breakdown of your opponent's deck, but also how much did it matter? Because everybody's playing white and black. So who cares what the color break like? There's not that big of a range between those two.
You're going
to
notice pretty quickly based on what land your opponent plays first if they're playing black or white.
Exactly. It's way different than sitting down and seeing that your opponent's like playing mono blue. That like tells you a lot more, I feel like, if you were playing in an environment with 5 colors. So that's a cube where I feel like they kind of got hemmed in by the initial assumption or like the initial sort of pitch, and then sort of committed to that bit so hard that it kind of became meaningless. It's like, okay, we're all playing black and white cards. I mean, we're all going to have creatures and removal. It doesn't really matter if you play black creatures or white creatures or black removal or white removal. Like, it's going to be kind of the same. And maybe the whole cube is an art project just to make that point. I don't know, in which case it's very successful.
That's a great solution. If you ever feel like you're stuck, just say, oh, it's art. And that's why it doesn't make sense.
And to be clear, I had a fun time playing this cube.
Yeah.
I drafted this cube at CubeCon and had a good time playing it. It's not that it's like a failure of a cube, but I do think that there's not much more to explore there based on the sort of fences that cube designer has laid out for themselves.
Yeah, and I think going back to that idea of like when everything is one thing, it doesn't matter, it ceases to exist. There's a lot of interesting, throughout the history of Magic, black and white cards that pair off of each other that are, the black-white and the white knight, and cards that explicitly have protection from the other. And when you take away the blue and green and red cards, it's like, well, those pairings don't even really exist anymore because it's just my creatures versus your creatures. I guess it matters if you're playing another player of the same color. I don't know. Like, those contrasts actually start to become a little bit muddled when you eliminate the background.
The extreme example is like when you made your mono black cube, it's like, no, there's no color. Literally, black is meaningless. Like, it means nothing. So it's completely gone. It's removed from the equation entirely. Black's identity is in context of all the other colors. And when you take them away, it's like, okay, well, these are all just generic casting costs now. And the color pie is not a thing.
Yeah, which is maybe another interesting example to take apart a little bit. So I built that cube that was mono black, and I think that describing it as an art project is not totally unreasonable or an experiment. The question I had was, can we make Magic still fun? Can we make a cube draft still fun if we eliminate color? And the way to do that is not necessarily to just say, there is no color, tap whatever lands you want, but just to only have one color. When you have one color, nothing matters. That makes sense, right? So I think that on one level, that cube was fairly resonant, and players that really enjoyed playing black were compelled by it. And were like, oh, that sounds awesome. I love playing black. Like, put me in that cube. But then the expectations weren't necessarily delivered because, there was no contrast there. And it was just like, okay, we're all just drafting the same thing. Is there a way that you could see making that more compelling or more resonant or deliver more than just that one single point?
We've already mentioned that, but I think something like the Fire Swamp or the Red Terror is a good example of how you can have a whole cube that is about a color without hemming yourself into literally only including cards of that color, which would not as satisfactorily answer your question of like, can we play Magic without color? Because
it would not have served that experiment, but it would have probably been a better experience overall.
I think it would have had more depth and more room for you to explore different archetypes as a designer and maybe some more replayability. But yeah, I think like I'm very excited always to play a cube that is like 60% a single color or 70% a single color and then the rest, divided up, or 80% just a guild and then the rest is, the other 3 colors. Like, that kind of asymmetry is really exciting to me. The same way I'd be excited to play a cube of any kind of asymmetry like that, right? If the cube is 60% instants, I'm interested. Sign me up. If the cube is the instant cube and everything is instants, I'm not really that interested.
Instant cube. I'm shocked that I've never heard that before. Somebody's going to make the instant cube immediately.
I'm sure it exists. I'm sure there is an instant/flash cube out there where everything can be played at instant speed.
It's just a funny name.
Yeah, I get it.
Instant cube. Just add water. It's a cube with no blue.
Just You have to add the water. Wait, it's a cube with no blue cards in it, but you only get Iowans out of the basic land box, so you have to add the water to make the cards.
Now, this is a resonant cube.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So we've talked about a bunch of them already, but maybe it's worth just like explicitly laying out some of the types of hooks that you can have to get people engaged in a cube. Obviously, like just referencing a well-established cube trope is an easy way to do it. So if you're just saying like, this is my cube, it is like the MTGO vintage cube, or this is like the pauper cube. That's a really easy way to set clear expectations and get people to know what your cube is all about.
Yeah. But I also think those cubes are not actually...
You're saying that's not a great goal, but I think that's where a lot of people are starting from.
Well, yeah, I'm just saying that, like, I don't think the pauper cube, if it didn't exist and you were to invent it right now, is like a resonant
No,
name.
totally. And that's what I'm saying is like that resonance only exists because there is this cultural artifact that is the vintage cube.
Yeah.
So again, like context matters. If your players do not get that reference, then it's going to have zero resonance. But if they are already sort of steeped in this cube world, then that might mean a lot to them.
Sure.
We've talked a lot about different themes and especially how like the themes can pair with mechanics like color and balance cubes, but I think you can take that thematic and aesthetic hook much further. I'm thinking of another cube in our play group that is called The Campaign, and it's all about knights or dragons. And again, I really like that this cube is just leaning a little bit towards knights and dragons. Like you're going to see one in every pack, or maybe a little bit more, but it's not like every single card is a knight and a dragon. And I think that it really delivers on that expectation of just being like, yeah, I'm going to see certain creature types, I'm going to see a lot of high fantasy, and the gameplay is going to match those expectations where sometimes there's going to be a giant 7-mana dragon that's going to take over a game, but often it's going to be my swarms of little knights that are what the gameplay is all about. And you can take this in all kinds of directions. I think May's Fey Cube is obviously a really great example of that, where the hook is all about you're going to play with a bunch of fairies and other little fey creatures, and that sets people's expectations and also, I think, gets people interested and excited in the kind of aesthetic experience of the cube that they're going to have. Sort of similar to pointing to an existing cube that's well known is clear restrictions, just saying this cube is largely about or all about just commons or just uncommons or rares or just some colors. And maybe I think this is like a bigger conversation, but that idea of like being focused on but not entirely all about restrictions is maybe a little bit more interesting and nuanced. But it's definitely a clear way to set expectations for players that maybe doesn't have resonance in the same kind of like aesthetic engagement as something like the Fey Cube, but again, sets clear expectations and distinguishes, like it highlights why your cube is different from another. Custom rules, again, I think this is an area where it's like you can easily go overboard, but that's a very clear way to set your cube apart and send a message about what your cube is all about. So stuff like the Turbo Cube and the Cascade Cube. Beyond that, I think things get a little bit more difficult to define. Are there any cubes that you think do a great job of creating resonance through particular key cards that are kind of benchmarks for what the gameplay is about?
Well, 100 Ornithopters does that.
Yeah, I did
it's
not.
It's like you're just teeing me up. I'm trying not to talk about it a bunch, but I'm really struggling to think of anything other than all the other sort of 100X or, heavily influenced spin-offs. I think Jane's The Ball Pit has a lot going on. It's a complicated cube, but I think a really important part of that is what's the mirror with affinity for artifacts, the 4/4 for 7?
Mirror Enforcer?
Yeah. It has, I believe, 16 copies of Mirror Enforcer. I should say, this is a cube where you can play any card face down as a copy of Chromatic Sphere. So obviously the cube is about Chromatic Sphere, very substantially. But there's a lot of other cards that have very heavy singleton breaks that become very central to that cube. Like, I think in that cube, for example, if you're playing a card that can't beat Mirror Enforcer in combat, it better be super duper cheap or have a lot of great utility, because you're very likely in the average game to have your opponent play a Mirror Enforcer at some point. So you should be thinking about 4/4 as like a really relevant stat line that you need to be able to combat, or a way for you to have your own Mirror Enforcers beat their Mirror Enforcers, right? Give them first strike or whatever. I think that the sort of heavy singleton breaks in that cube also make it very much about individual cards. And Mirror Enforcers is another good example of like that tells you there's also other artifacts floating around, and there are a lot of other artifacts in the ball pit. They're not just the spheres you're playing face down.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, maybe what I'm realizing is this is another way you can set yourself up for failure. I feel like one way that's reasonable to describe a cube is be like, hey, here's 5 cards that I think are cards you're going to be excited to play, and that's going to sort of set expectations. Like if I tell you, here's the regular cube, White Mane Lion is a B+, like be excited about it. Let's not quibble over whether that's the right rating.
I wasn't going to quibble, I swear.
Great. that'll give you a sense of what the cube is about. But I think that that's also a little bit risky, because if somebody says, well, I drafted that card you said was an A and it didn't really perform that way, well, that's like an easy way to set the wrong expectations.
Yeah, I'm really happy with how I describe Sacred Geometry right now, which is that I came up with like, I think 4 groupings of 5 cards, one in each color, that just describe the range of cards you're going to find. And the first one is just efficient icons, I think is what I call it. It's like, these are just good cards that are powerful and like very iconic, right? That's your Swords to Plowshares, your Lightning Bolt, your Birds of Paradise, your Counterspell, that kind of stuff. The second group I have here is like aspirational big threats. These are kind of like the mostly Baneslayers of the environment. This is where you have like Archangel of Thune or Colonian Hydra or Twin Flame Tyrant, which to me is like an important part of this cube, is that I want aspirational big threats to be worth it. And in a cube like Bun Magic, which also plays all these iconic, efficient cards, they're not worth it because they would just get destroyed. It wouldn't be worth your time.
That's cool, because you're sort of doing 2 things at once. You're both saying these are the cards in each color that are kind of representing these aspirational threats, but also you're telling people there are aspirational threats. Like, by giving those specific examples, you're implying a lot more about what the environment's going to be like.
I think especially in contrast to the efficient and powerful icons, because those are really powerful cards that can go a lot of different cubes, so they don't really actually tell you a whole lot about the power level here, other than there are some very good cards. This could be, a power vintage cube, or it could be something more regular cube-esque. And I think the aspirational big threats, unless I'm lying about all 5 of these cards being playable, and they're all trash, which I hope is not the case, unless I'm lying about that, you learn a lot about this environment by knowing this is the kind of cube where you can play Demonic Tutor alongside Shadowborn Demon, right? Like, that tells a big story. This next category has even worse cards. Minimalist role players, which are cards that are very simple, do one thing, and, are cards that you're going to want in your deck just because they play an essential role, mostly like removal and stuff, that are just very simple cards. Your Pacifism, for example, is in this cube. Pretty bad as far as like power level of removal goes by comparison, but it's one of those cards that like, it's still fine. There's a lot of situations, even in powerful Magic, where you're happy to have a Pacifism. It's just that if you're playing the most powerful cards and you're looking at white removal, you got to go way down the list before you arrive at Pacifism. So Pacifism and Unsummon and Rampant Growth are like these cards that they do the thing, but they're like not appealing. They don't jump off the page at you. They're not as sort of powerful as the other cards you've been looking at. And then my fourth category here is just like pet cards. And this is where I sort of am pointing out that I play Eternal Dragon and I play Unearth and Think Twice and Mana Gorger Hydra, cards that are also kind of bad, but just cards that I like. And I feel like for a lot of people, this is like a nice, concise way to like say, hey, here's the range of what is playable. You can take a Swords of Plowshares, you can take an Archangel of Thune, you can take a Pacifism, you can take an Eternal Dragon. They all are playable here. And that tells you a lot about the sort of consistency, the range of the power level disparities, and like what you can maybe expect out of the environment. At least I think it does.
Yeah. No, I really love this way of presenting it, and I think it does create that resonance on multiple levels, both just like showing us some of the cards that we think are going to matter, and that tells me a lot about what to expect. And also by putting them in these groupings, the groupings give you a very specific narrative of both your intentions and then what that cube is going to look like and what are the types of things that are going to matter in games.
It also gives you like a nice clean elevator pitch just to like collapse all of them, right? Like, this is a cube full of efficient, powerful icons, aspirational big threats, minimalist role players, and some of my pet cards, right? People can then ask, what do you mean by minimalist role players? And you can say, oh, I mean Pacifism, or I mean Innocent Blood. But it like does give you sort of unfolding opportunities for clarification.
Definitely. Man, that's just reminding me how bad my cube overviews are.
This is my most recent one, and I think it is the best at terms of actually communicating to a would-be player what this environment is going to be like.
Yeah. So just to sort of finish up this list, I think another obvious way to create a specific hook is to have a very specific mechanical style or a very specific type of gameplay, like saying this is the cube that's really all about combat. And again, like, be careful, because if you miss on that, then you could set people up for being a little bit disappointed. But
the number of people I've heard complain that the cube called something Tempo Cube doesn't actually care about tempo. I mean, you chose a word that is like so hotly contested as to what it even means in this game. You're really playing with fire there.
But maybe it's like very heavy in bouncing mechanics. We have in our playgroup the Esper Bouncy Castle, and Crystal Shard is very good there, and you're doing a lot of bouncing back and forth. So you can definitely effectively and successfully build around a mechanical theme and use that as the entry point for explaining and sort of setting people's expectations for the cube.
I'm going to talk to Mateo. I think I'm going to petition for that cube to be called Esper Bounce House, which I've heard people call it that.
I mean, I could just change the name on
I think
the local
bounce
playgroup
house, that the sort of assonance of bounce house,
It's the tempo of bounce house.
it's so much stickier than Esper bouncy castle, which is like 3 different things. Esper bounce house is like boom, boom, boom. Anyway, I've heard people like mistakenly refer to it as that because I think it's just more.
And you think we should just do what the masses say, like do the little classic desire path thing and just call it 100 Ornithopters Cube or whatever?
I'm not going to call it Ornithopter Cube. There's a fine line between desire paths and like design by committee, and knowing how to navigate that, I think, is really important.
The last thing I had on my list was, and tell me if you think this makes any sense, but defining a cube in opposition to another cube. I feel like this just happens so frequently and is a clear way to shortcut, like, what is your cube about? Well, it's not like that one. Assuming people know the cube that you're defining in opposition to, that can communicate a lot fairly quickly.
I would broaden that a little bit to say there's a pattern of cubes being designed to be very clearly in dialogue with one other cube. And I will continue to thank Zach for letting me just steal that little turn of phrase because it's very useful.
I hope people have put that on the bingo card.
But you've said before that the regular cube was kind of in opposition to the Bud Magic cube, but I think a lot of people would look at those cubes and say they have 100 cards overlapping.
Yeah,
what do you mean
that's a good point.
What do you mean they're in opposition to each other? It's in opposition the way that like salt and pepper are opposites. Use them both at the same time.
That's exactly the example I was thinking of too.
Yeah.
They're not opposites in the sense that they share nothing in common. They're opposites in that they are different in one specific axis.
Exactly, right. And then my Sacred Geometry cube, honestly, is kind of a response to the regular cube, where I think you have a lot of goals that I really love, and I also want to see an environment.
Some things I really screw up on.
I don't dislike your design goals, and I don't think you should change your cube to be like mine, but it's like, okay, there's a lot of things I really like there, but also I want to see that with like 2 other things tweaked, right? Like, what if I had this cube, but I didn't have compunctions around playing slightly more power outliers and also slightly more iconic cards, right? Like, one of your goals is very explicitly to like not include cube staples. You're like, no, look, we're going to go 1.5 steps down below every cube staple, and we're still going to find a bunch of beautiful playable cards that are fun. And I'm like, put Counterspell in there. Like, we don't need 4 cancel variants that are all like slightly weird upsides on Counterspell. We can just play Counterspell. That's like a subtle distinction that means that, again, Sacred Geometry is not the opposite of the regular cube. It is like in dialogue with it. And I think it actually works a lot and can especially work like in a local playgroup, right? Like, you don't have to have a popular cube that you're in opposition to or in dialogue with. We've talked about the oldest school, which basically was like, I built my neoclassical cube, Alex played it for the first time, enjoyed it, but also was like,
where are all the bad kitchen table cards I used to play with?
Well, I think it was like it reminded him of all the cards he used to play with, that he was like, I wish there was room for these, but I also understand how there's not, given that your cube is at this particular power level and playing with this sort of tempo and like, you know, play patterns. So the oldest school started as a cube where Alex's rule for himself is he was not allowed to include anything that was in neoclassical cube because it was too good. It had to be worse than all the cards in neoclassical cube. And that's a great example of like, again, not the opposite. It's actually kind of exactly the same, but just it's in dialogue with that cube. But that made it for a very compelling elevator pitch to anybody in our playgroup that knew what the neoclassical cube was. They were like, oh, cool, that, but like everything's jankier, you know?
Definitely. So that list is definitely not comprehensive by any means, but are there other, like, either specific cubes or broad types of approaches to making a resonant cube experience?
I do really like people that like create a third thing, you know, where it's like you could try and directly connect name to mechanics or like, you know, superficial aspects to mechanical aspects. Or you could create a third thing and you could attach the superficial aspects like the name to that third thing, and you can attach the mechanical aspects, the cards you include in the cube, to that thing as well, without them necessarily being directly touching each other. I think that opens up a lot of space. I really think that's what the Fire Swamp is for the most part. Like, that's a cube where it's like you made this third thing, you made like a cool, compelling name for something, and then are trying to like use that as the connective tissue to like tie everything together. And I think the Bodleian cube is another cube, for example, that I think has... Now, I have a pet peeve with that name, which is that no one knows how to pronounce it or spell it, which I think just logistically is annoying. So, and I think Jake has felt this, so I don't think Jake would counter my description of that as a very annoying name to have to spell or pronounce. But I think it does a pretty good job of being like, most people don't know what the Bodleian library is. I didn't until I learned about it through the cube. So it has an air of something to it, but that something is not immediately explaining you what the cards are like, but it pretty quickly, once you actually like understand, starts to tell, I think, a pretty cogent story in terms of what that cube is all about.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if the most extreme version of that is just like make up your own resonance, just like
yes.
Once you become the thing that is iconic that people can attach to, you no longer need to lean on something external that people are pointing to get that connection.
Yeah, I think the way Eli Altman puts it in his book, Don't Call It That, is you want something ownable. And so you can't use something a bunch of people already have a bunch of associations with because there's no room for you to own that. And there is room for you to own the Fire Swamp or Bodleian or Penrose or whatever. You can kind of make that what you feel like it should be. And I think picking a third thing rather than being like, I'm the 16th Esper Cube that is in like the Esper Cube world. It's like, all right, we've got Esper Cubes. And again, no disrespect. I know you're out there. Maybe Mateo's listening. I have multiple friends with Esper Cubes. I'm not saying those are like less than or whatever.
And also, as far as like things to nitpick about a cube, this is like the least important. Like you chose good cards, you made a fun cube. That's
yeah. None of this indicates like a failing of a cube. But if you are striving specifically for resonance, which some people might care more or less, if your play group is already like pretty well set and there's not a lot of variation and you don't really care to grow the group, then it's probably very minimally important for you to like be resonant with your superficial choices about your cube. But I think, especially if you are trying to actively grow your play group and or like submitting your cube to be part of events and you want people to be able to look at it on a list of cubes and have a correct feeling about it, then yeah, I think rather than being, I don't think I've ever seen a teamer cube. I'm sure they're out there, but I don't have any personal friends with a teamer cube.
That's the one no one's tried yet.
It's instead of being a teamer cube where you just play all the teamer cards and it's all the best teamer cards ever printed and you just power max within teamer. Instead of doing that, what appeals to you about that? Why would you want to make the teamer cube? What is it about the teamer, shard, wedge, whichever one it is, that is exciting? And then describe that, right? Is it that you like the sort of rugged, sort of nomadic wilderness sort of vibe that you get from the teamer? Describe it as, the Outlanders cube or whatever. Like, give it a name that is evocative of what you actually care about, not a reference to the thing within Magic that is like very blunt.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a great way for people to recontextualize and have a little bit more ownership and tell a more compelling story about the kind of experience they're trying to create for people.
If you could just ask yourself, like, pretend that you're talking to a 4-year-old and the 4-year-old is just asking you why at the end of everything you say. Play that game with yourself a little bit when you're thinking of like what your goals are for your cube and how to express them. Like, my cube is about red. Why? Well, because red is my favorite color. Why? Well, because red has opportunities to be both really aggressive and really controlling, so it's like super flexible. Now we're getting to something, right? What you're drawn to is not red superficially. You're drawn to this idea of a color that can play both sides of this aggro control spectrum, and maybe the cube is about that sort of dichotomy, and you can describe that with a word or selection of words that better gets to the thing that's underlying your actual goal.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a great process that people could give a try.
I wish there were more jobs in professional naming. There's just not. There's like 2 agencies I'm aware of that do it, and they're very small, and I don't think they're hiring. But I think it's really fun. I guess I would honestly not enjoy doing it professionally because the only people that can afford to hire professional namers are going to be just the worst companies on the face of planet Earth that are trying to hire you basically to like launder or like hide some sort of awful like monopoly or control of capital so they can like seem like they're cool and like, edgy or cool and approachable and natural when actually they're just like an awful piece of shit. So I wouldn't actually enjoy it, but I like naming stuff that's cool.
Do you want to advertise your service here for affordable naming?
No, but I will say, it's been announced that I am working with Greg and a couple other people, Hayu, to bring this event Shoebox to life next year. And my role is very minimal. I was like, guys, I don't got that much time. I love you, but I'm not actually interested in event organizing. But I am really interested in naming and branding. And they had an idea for the name, which I won't tell you what it was because it doesn't matter. But it was like, to my eyes, like pretty generic and hard to own. And they were kind of already set. They had like registered the LLC, and I was like, could I pitch perhaps some different alternatives? And I pitched a bunch of ideas, and one of them was Shoebox. And they were like, oh, actually, yeah, we like that a lot more.
That's a great name. I love that.
I'm really grateful that they like were willing to hear that, and I'm really happy with how the event's identity is starting to form, right? We're trying really to sort of evoke the type of Magic playing that I think a lot of people could identify with when they were much younger, right? The sort of naive kitchen table playing where you kept your cards in a shoebox, you just had fun with your friends, there were no competitive stakes, you were just like in it for like the right reasons, right? That's what we're trying to evoke. And so like the visuals are like kind of vaguely like 90s inspired, kind of bright colors, very fun, very playful, also meant to sort of be very welcoming. And yeah, the name Shoebox, I think it just kind of, we don't have to like hit you over the head with it. The logo is not like cards in a shoebox. Like that comes through even if the logo has nothing to do visually with those sort of ideas. So I won't like talk a bunch more about like branding and my ideas about that, but that kind of resonance of like, you got to pick a third thing. Some people would say, don't call your event Shoebox unless you're selling shoes or boxes. And it's like, that's the direct thing. Don't ever do the direct thing. Always do the sort of indirect thing, because when you do indirect thinking, that's where there's room to actually like own something and form an identity.
I don't know. I think sometimes you can just be like, this is just a regular cube. This exactly describes it perfectly.
I mean, to be perfectly honest, I think you could just cop to the fact that like you don't really care for it to be like pitched or resonant. I think the presentation is very honest and flat. It's like, here it is. Take it or leave it.
Yeah, that's fair.
And I think it's okay. Like, not everyone has to listen to this and like want to do this for their cube, but I think for those that do, and I think for a lot of people, like, they have one cube, right? And so it is a place they sink a lot of their creative energy. You have a lot of cubes. You've made a lot over the years. You also have a lot of other creative outlets. So for you, maybe, you know, having this one cube be super resonant is not like, who cares? But for somebody that does have their one cube, and right now it's just called Jenny's Cube or whatever, you can do better. And I think you might be interested in expressing more of all the beautiful creative thought you've put into what that cube is. The joy comes from communicating that to people and having them get it and see your vision. And so if this is a creative outlet for you, if you want people to see and appreciate the work you've put in, I think you should think about this because it's fun. It's just because it's fun. It's fun to kind of try and figure out a way to conceptualize and describe something in a way that jumps off the page at somebody and also feels unique and ownable.
I think that's a great way to punctuate this is ultimately the game is here for fun. We play Cube for fun, and trying to do it in a way that is more creative and expressive and resonant with people is part of the fun for many of us.
Yeah, it's absolutely not that like this is the right way to like pitch a cube or make a cube resonant or you should make your cube resonant. It's none of that. It's that I think people that have not thought about this angle might enjoy thinking about it and might find more room for creative expression.
Agreed.
Then on that bombshell, that brings us to the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All the music for this show is produced by DJ James Nasty, and the show is edited by Matthew. If you want to support us and the work we're doing, you can find us on Patreon. That helps pay Matthew for his editing work, helps put money back into the community through the Cube Fellowship, and also helps us maybe take some risks on some things. I've got a couple of maybe like little projects I'm imagining, and having a little bit of money to like throw into it means that you can afford to take a risk and maybe be a little more bold, which I appreciate everyone that supports us so we can do that. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast, and this podcast is produced by thinking really hard about Magic cards and then speaking into microphones about it. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and the gift of Cube.
Thanks for talking about resonance with me, and honestly, just a great job on all the Shoebox design stuff. I'm very excited by that.
It's about to be updated. This is like, it's coming in phases.
First edition?
This is first edition, and they had to launch. I didn't have time. Look, it's going to be even better. There's a lot coming down the pike.
Very exciting.